Welcome to Raising Financially Fit Families with Joline Godfrey podcast. I'm your podcast producer, RJ Malik. Joline, hello. So good to see you again. And I see you have a guest with you. So what I'm going to do is just throw it to you. You can take it away, and kind of excited to hear both of you and the podcast today.
Thanks, RJ. It's good to be back here. And Amber, welcome to you. This is Amber Slattery, my friend and colleague. And today we're going to talk about stages of financial education. And Amber, thank you for being with me again. It's always good to talk to you. And today's topic, we certainly hope does not sound academic, but we also know that it was a favorite topic of Jean Piaget, who was a Frenchman, and how appropriate that you're talking to us from Paris. So, welcome.
Thanks, Joline.
Why don't you get us started? I mean, why are we talking about this today, and what questions do you have?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Well, I think we're talking about it today because I'm holding up the book that you wrote, Joline. I know you're on your third edition now. I have the second edition, I think. And it's Raising Financially Fit Kids. And I think in it, you really did pioneer the ages and stages approach to financial education, saying, a 4 to 6 year old knows this, a 7 to 10-year-old is ready to know that. And I think maybe we could just start by taking you back to when you were pioneering this approach. Why did you feel the need was there to structure thinking that way? And just what was the landscape at that time? What was that like?
It's interesting. So I think when the first edition came out, it was 2003. So it was the beginning of, the 21st century. And I had not too long before that finished a project interviewing adult women entrepreneurs. And one of the things that got clear in those interviews was that no one had talked to them about money when they were little girls. And certainly in my own experience, nobody had really talked to me. I watched my grandmother run the family business. I knew the women in my family were not stupid when it came to money, but I don't know how intentional any conversations were. And then when I finished the interviews with those adult entrepreneurs, it really hit me that in spite of the fact we know that children learn to walk and talk and actually absorb ethics even in a developmental way, somehow in the growing up process, we mostly had missed the fact that there are, in fact, stages of financial development. And so when people grew up and ended up having either terrible credit scores or didn't really feel comfortable talking about or managing money, it was because they'd had no practice. And they didn't have practice because we just assumed that somehow you learn about money by osmosis. And in those pre-internet, you almost could. I mean, parents and grandparents could say wise things like a penny saved is a penny earned, or save for a rainy day. And, you would pick up decent habits, or you could, or sometimes you did. But it wasn't intentional in any way. And the more complicated the financial landscape has become, particularly, post-internet, the more important it is to begin early and to get some practice before you're out in the world and having to navigate all of this on your own. So I guess I was just awakening to the fact that developmental stages needed to be described to people. And today I would say it's even more important. So that's a long response.
Well, that, it was 20 years ago, but I think even today, it's not uncommon that you might speak with families and they say, four is really young. Do we need to start there? And I think what was a bit of a light bulb for me is when you talked about financial parenting as being a totally different thing from what a financial advisor or maybe a therapist or a teacher might think of as training, put in quotes, for the little ones. I think your emphasis on financial parenting is a bit of a revelation for people. And when they see that approach, it makes a little bit more sense, maybe.
Yes. And in fairness, it took me a long time to understand the difference between financial education for children and financial parenting myself. I would say what's exciting for me about doing this third edition of Raising Financially Fit Kids is I do much more of an emphasis on the financial parenting piece because, it also finally dawned over my marble head that parents didn't get this training either. And it turns out, as we all know, children train parents from a very early age. So you walk in the door for the first time and you haven't brought a chocolate bar or a gift. And the kid says to the parent who's been out of town, "Where's my present?" And the parent feels suddenly guilty because the kid knows that that parent coming in the door has been away and they should have something. And it's in these tiny, subtle, what we would call micro actions that children teach parents and parents teach kids. And the process actually begins as early as 18 months. Kids are picking things up. So I say that to parents, and I always feel guilty because at 18 months, your hands are full trying to deal with what it means to be a new parent. So I don't want anybody to feel too alarmed. On the other hand, what I do say is you have to remember that kids are picking up your habits, your values, the things you say, the way you behave from their earliest days. And so a kind of mindfulness about what habits and values you're passing on comes through in the books you read to them, in the games you play with them, in the things you say just casually. But one of the most important things that families do say to me that I do want to emphasize is, about the 4-year-old, they'll just say, "Oh, they're so young. I just want kids to be kids. I just want them to be able to be happy and be kids." And me too is my response. I want them to be kids too. But they are already learning. I mean, by then they are learning to speak. They are learning to walk and talk and balance themselves. Developmentally, those little brains are churning away by the nanosecond, really. And so you have all of these teachable moments. And if you miss them, you don't get them back. So it is in their play. Now, I don't want parents to start throwing spreadsheets up on their cribs or, or to go into long, lengthy time value of money lectures. I want them to begin to develop language and values. That's really where we're starting when children are 3, 4, 5, 6.
Well, I think this language and values that we start with for the really little kids, parents might also be surprised that that language and values, it's actually the connector to as they get older and we do start talking about teen learning, which is when a lot of parents start to think, okay, this is the right time. So much of that continues to be language and values that they learned when they were younger, but now we're adding more things to it. So, I certainly work a lot with the teens and 20s crowd, but maybe you could talk too about that link from, okay, what's happening in those teen years that makes that opportunity so ripe to get started?
Well, I think you see even more than I do, given that you do work with teens more than I do these days. But parents are telegraphing their expectations. And by the time those kids get to be adolescents and teenagers, they're really tuned in to who their parents are and what those expectations are. And they're also tuned into the mixed messaging that parents give. So on the one hand, the parent will say, "Well, you must be careful with money." Meanwhile, Saturday morning comes and we go off to the mall and there's a big shopping spree and suddenly, all rules are off. And it's like, wait, what am I supposed to pay attention to? And so I think the mixed messaging becomes problematic for kids. There needs to be some continuity. I think of a family that I have I worked with for a very long time, and I just by accident happened to be in the kitchen one morning when I think the 8-year-old walked in and he wanted something. And he said to his mother, I want such and such. And she said no. And his response was, why not? You can afford it. And her response was, well, just because we can doesn't mean we should. So he grumpily walked off and he heard his mother, but it happened that it was a couple of years later that I was in that same kitchen. There was a similar conversation, and I remember his mother just looking at him, and he said, oh, I know, I know. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And I realized that in that household, the between the ages of about 8 and 10, the message had been given repeatedly so that that kid internalized what the parents believed, that yes, indeed, you are growing up in privilege and a bit of abundance. But just because I can afford it doesn't mean that we should all the time. So I think that practice is one of the reasons we start early, because kids need to hear the same message over and over. And in those years, particularly between 7 and 10, if you think of the earliest years between 3, 4, and 6 or 7 as readiness years, and 7 to 10 or 11 as practice years, you're getting messages across that you want them to live with for the rest of their lives. And so by the time they show up in your programming, when you're dealing with the adolescents and teenagers, you're dealing with kids who are not just at the beginning necessarily, but who kind of know that there are some things I have to be paying attention to.
Right. And it's even a question of they might have internalized what their parents have told them. And even if those lessons were good, still might at this age start to have their own ideas about what they are curious about with regard to money. And I think what's interesting working with teens, the first meeting is frequently with the parents, and you get a sense of what the parents would like you to discuss. And the parent might want their child to have a really strong understanding of investments. And then you meet with the child, and it's not that they don't want to talk about investments, but they're more interested in entrepreneurship. And at that age, I think a good advisor follows that curiosity and is happy that they have some type of curiosity, and kind of have to tell the parents, and I know we had this outline, but if we want the learning to be more effective, I'm kind of going to go with wherever the 14-year-old is interested, because let's harness that energy. It's not the time to be prescriptive. It's the time to take on whatever passion they feel for financial services or just the financial world in general. And I also think at that age, some of these lessons might start to crystallize a bit more, because they are getting closer to financial autonomy. So if you're talking to a 14, 15-year-old, they know that college is going to have to be paid for. They're suddenly kind of curious. Well, is that coming from this trust that I've heard I have? Or is this a gift from my grandpa? No one's talked to me about that. So I think as the questions in their own life become more sophisticated and this becomes more applicable, some really rich discussions can come from that, and they're guided by the team. And with that age group too, I love working with the 14 to 20-year-old age group. And so a lot of my references come back to them. But I've talked about this with families too, who might want to, they want to get their teens on family committees right away. They want the teen to be a part of some form of family governance from that age. And I like to pause and just remind them of the story of the hero's journey, the story that is across many different cultures. And it's the idea that a young person starts off in their community and then goes out and learns something that's interesting to them, and then has this ability to come back and help the community with the wisdom they have. And I tell parents, we're kind of at this phase where I want to follow what your child's interested in. I have plenty of things I could guide them toward as well, but let's let them go learn a little bit and follow their own interest, so that then whatever they're bringing back to the family investment committee, to the family philanthropic committee, has a little bit of their own thought process in it. And sometimes that resonates. And but I think that's what makes this age so special. There's a lot of different opportunities for them to go off and learn what is interesting to them. But I will say, and Joline, I'm so curious your thoughts on this. I'm sure we've all seen a very sophisticated 15-year-old and maybe a 35-year-old who doesn't know as much as that 15-year-old. So some of this is ages and stages development wise, but the more adult they get, some of it is just what they've been exposed to. How do you reconcile those two age groups?
Well, there are two things here. And I always say, remember, we're talking development, not chronology, which are completely different. But I want to go back to that 14-year-old for a moment and the parent who wants them to learn investment. If you are really starting where the kid is, you're going to pick up on those kids who have readiness, who have had parents who got them prepared for that. And maybe doing some practice, to use my next stage, with that 14-year-old is completely appropriate. But if they haven't had readiness, you and I have to figure out how to get them ready to learn investing. It is something that you can't skip. They're going to have to do it one way or the other. And that's, I think, what we mean in terms of developmental stages, because the more you're ready, the easier the practice stage is. And I do want to make one other point here, because it speaks to this financial parenting question you raised a moment ago. The parental voice is quieter to children as they reach adolescence and are growing into their own independence in a very normal way. But with the advent of the internet, social media, influencers, all the other distractions coming into their lives, the parental voice is getting undermined. And so those parents who wait too long are going to miss the opportunity to have that kid internalize their voice and their values, more importantly, altogether. So the early teachable moments in that readiness phase between 3, 4, and 7, 8 is really hard to get back, or it's hard to get back in an easy way. So you and I, if those kids haven't gotten readiness early on, you and I get another opportunity. We do some time on readiness, but it does, to your point, slow the process. And that hero's journey that I think you so brilliantly talk about is a longer journey. And we both know adults who come to us saying, listen, I never got this. And we have to spend time with them, getting them ready, because the financial landscape is not an easy one. It's complicated. It's like, you talk about this all the time. The process of getting fluent in a new language, whether it's French or money, is a very tough, intentional process. You might want to talk about that for a second.
I'm thinking back to families who are hoping that we can kind of skip stages with their child, or a family. It's common for a parent to say, oh, my child already knows a lot about this. They took Econ 101. And we know, that's great. And they learned a lot, but there are 10 money skills, and learning about the economics of the world is one of them. And that might not help you on your personal budget and spending. In fact, I'm sure it won't. So I think some of this is getting around a culture in the family that sometimes I'll see it like a culture of posturing too, of, oh, we already know this. We're just working on one other aspect. And that's what the parent is saying the culture is, and that's what the parent is directing that they want their child's educational path to be. And we really need to have a one-on-one with them, with the learner.
So I'm going to cut in to say, and you remind me that those 10 money skills that we say are part of kind of the whole picture also require what you and I talk about is fish. So developmentally, not only are we trying to nurture an awareness and a language around 10 financial skills, but because we want kids to grow up understanding that wealth or money or capital, more importantly, isn't just about money. It's about your intellectual and social and human capital as well. And so, how you translate intellectual wealth or a social wealth to a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old is really different from the way you talk about it to a 15-year-old. And not too long ago, you and I did another podcast on hidden human capital and aunts as human capital in the family. So again, how you introduce the value of aunts and uncles and grandparents to little ones versus how you make the importance of those social connections clear to teenagers and grown adults. It's very different. So this really is a journey, whether it's the hero's journey or the financial parenting journey. We're talking about a lifelong process here, not something you do in a class or a semester or an hour in a family meeting. This is lifelong work. It's different.
But in a way, I am struck that we're kind of closing out right where we began, which is it is language and values. So no matter what age, if we're starting with our 4-year-olds, if we're dealing with a 35-year-old who is trying to self-educate, the language and the values that you just talked about through fish, that's kind of the whole game. And of course we use, I'll hold up the book again, the ages and stages to meet the needs of the client and where they are with their language and values along the way. But that's kind of the whole game. And I think that's just a helpful reminder as we think about these stages of financial education. Yes, we're always meeting somebody where they are, but that core way of bringing that awareness, it's always going to be language and values.
It's always going to be language and values. And I will just end by saying, I don't want families or anybody listening today to feel discouraged because, of course, our whole piece is to make sure they know this is infused with caring, with fun, with a sense of adventure. I mean, the hero's journey or the heroine's journey is one that is filled with excitement if you come with us, at least. So it's not just hard work, but it can be a real pleasure in a family. So I guess that's where I want to end today.
Very good. Before you go, though, we need contact information.
Ooh.
Joline, why don't you give out that info?
So to find more about how we approach the stages of financial parenting and financial development, go to www.bounce-10.com or send a note off to Amber, who is just Amber, AMBER, at bounce-10.com, or Joline, and that is JOLINE at bounce-10.com. And we will get back to you. We like talking to families about these things.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And looking forward to your next podcast. And thank you for listening to today's Raising Financially Fit Families with Joline Godfrey podcast. Please like, follow, and share this podcast with friends and family. And until our next podcast, for Joline Godfrey, I'm RJ Malik.